I lived in an old apartment in 2002. The place was built in 1900, so it was just over 100 years old when I moved in. The living room and kitchen were fine, but the bathroom and bedroom were unnerving. Like, I just always felt I was being watched, especially in the bedroom if the closet door was open. Those unnerving feelings just became moderately uncomfortable as I settled in. I felt safe in the bedroom, but only if the door was locked. One night, I was dead asleep when there was a loud bang on my bedroom door. When I got up the courage to get out of bed, I checked the apartment and all the windows were closed and locked from the inside. The door still had the chain secured. No one was in there. I mentioned the closet in the bedroom. I never liked going in there, and I never liked if the door was open. For some reason, in my head, I would hear gasping noises. So for that reason, the closet stayed closed. A month or more after, I was woken to the bang on my door. I was dead asleep once again, but something woke me up this time. And it was a pressure on me like being held down. It was pitch black in my room. I couldn't see anything, but I knew someone was standing over me. When I could finally turn on a bedside lamp, no one was there. After then, I couldn't sleep in the dark. I had to sleep with the lamp on. That incident scared the life out of me. And after that, the unnerving feeling of being watched intensified. Friends would come over and comment about being uncomfortable in the bathroom, like they were being watched. It became so uncomfortable for me. When I had the chance to move to another unit, I jumped at it. I packed everything up and I got out of there. After me, several people rented the apartment and they would move out within months. I became friendly with the building manager and I told him that I felt like the place was haunted. He kind of laughed it off. Years after, they were renovating the place. The building manager was doing some painting in there. The building owner was there too. I went and checked out the apartment, and it looked nicer. It didn't feel as creepy. I got to talking with the building owner, and through the course of the conversation, he just throws it out there that a former tenant committed suicide in the closet by hanging themselves. He also mentioned that the original designer of the building lived in that apartment and died in there. I wasn't mad when I heard that, but I definitely felt validated that what I experienced was real. This story is called Creepy Clown Encounter. Please be patient. I'm a long-time lurker, and this is my first post. I don't know if many of you remember this, but back in 2016, there was a creepy clown trend where people dressed as creepy killer clowns. They would hang out in dark places or stalk people. My story takes place on my college campus during fall of that year. I lived with my grandparents before leaving school, and I'm extremely close to them. Also, I'm very shy and had zero friends or people I regularly hung out with at school. I wanted to reach out and meet new folks, so I signed up for a salsa dancing club that met on Friday nights. I told my grandma over the phone, and she was happy I was putting myself out there. She asked if I was going with anybody. No, I told her. I'm just gonna go by myself. Are you sure? She asked. Don't any of your roommates want to go? The idea of talking to my roommates terrified me. I could handle structured gatherings, but personal conversations left more room for my awkwardness to creep in. No, they're not here. I don't want you walking around campus by yourself at night, my grandma said. I thought my grandma was just being overprotective. Grandma, it's fine. The streets are well lit, and it's only a 10-minute walk. It's perfectly safe. Well, she said, if you're not going with anybody, call me and let me talk to you on the phone as you walk back. Of course, I agreed. That evening was incredibly fun, learning the basic steps and dancing to upbeat Latin tunes. At around 10:30, I felt ready to head back to my dorm. So I snuck out of the building and headed toward my dorm room. Although the paved path I was walking on was lit by streetlights, it seemed darker than usual. In addition, the entire campus was deserted. Normally, there were quite a few kids my age wandering around, but that night, there was not a soul to be seen. I dialed my grandma and made small talk with her as I walked. I took my heels off and carried them in my free hand. Now, the path I was walking on went past a stretch of sidewalk that was perpendicular to the one I was taking. Under one of the streetlights, about 10 meters away, I noticed a lone figure standing with its back toward me. The figure, hearing me chatting on the phone, slowly turned toward me. He was tall and heavy-set, with wild red hair, and appeared to be wearing light blue pajamas. His face was obscured by a killer clown mask. The mask was stark white with dark black eye sockets and a twisted, malicious grin. Time seemed to suddenly slow way down. The clown did not move toward me. He simply stood there, staring. I knew I had to think fast. I contemplated my options. I could A, scream like a little girl and run, B, approach him and confront him, or C, pretend he didn't scare me. The entire moment I just described, I couldn't have lasted more than a second. But in that moment, it felt like an eternity. Are you there? I heard my grandma say. Remembering to breathe, with the phone still at my ear, I decided to go with plan C. I broke eye contact with the clown. "So anyway," I said loudly enough that the clown would hear me. "Yeah, I'm on my way," I continued. "Lopsided squid, what's going on? Is everything okay?" I heard my grandma ask, her voice suddenly filled with anxiety. As confidently and nonchalantly as I could, I walked past the sidewalk where the clown was standing, continuing to chat. His head slowly turned as I walked past, watching me until I was out of sight. I ducked into the archway of the nearest building and tried the door, trying to unlock it, but it was stuck. I tried once more, hoping that my luck would change, praying that it was unlocked and somehow it was just a little bit difficult to get pried open. It was. It happened to be unlocked. Thank God, I thought. Once I was inside, I slumped against one of the concrete walls and broke down in tears. I explained to my grandma what had just happened. My grandma yelled for my grandpa to dial the campus police on his cell phone so that I could stay on the line with her. I got up and started pacing up and down the empty halls, checking every door and window to see if the psycho clown had followed me. Was he just a stupid kid going out on a dare trying to scare people? Or was he someone with more evil intentions? I don't know. But some of the creepy clowns in the news had axes or baseball bats, and I just wasn't sure if mine was armed. When my grandpa tried to explain to the officer on the phone what happened and that I needed help, he told my grandpa, "Your granddaughter needs to make the call herself." Apparently, the reason I had to talk to them was so that they could be sure the call wasn't just a prank or some stupid reason like that. The point is that they wouldn't take my grandparents' word that I was in distress. I would have to hang up with my grandma and dial the campus police myself. Not knowing if I would survive the night, I told my grandma between sobs, "I love you." "I love you too." My grandma was also crying. I dialed campus police and told them who I was and what had happened. The officer on the phone sent several other officers to find me while I stayed on the phone with him and gave him a description of the clown. As I was talking, I heard a door open. I froze. Was the clown here? Did he find a way in? A tidal wave of relief washed over me as several officers came striding down the corridor. They walked with me back to my dorm. As soon as I was inside, I locked my door and window and I shut the blinds. I called my grandma back to tell her I was safe. After talking for a little while longer, we said goodnight. Since then, I've made a few friends at school. While I'm in a better place now, I don't go out alone after dark anymore. And as for that creepy clown, let's not meet again. This is one of 2 paranormal experiences I've had that I have a hard time wrapping my head around. It's a long read, but settle in, because it's worth it. I've suffered from insomnia as far back as I can remember. I was in 2nd grade, and it was really early in the morning. I think around 5 or so. I had a little TV on my nightstand and was definitely watching LOTR on VHS. Lord of the Rings, in case you didn't catch that. I had the volume up super loud because my ceiling fan always made a ruckus throughout the night. I was super into the movie when all of the sudden, all of the sound around me started to slowly fade away. I remember I became confused and reached to turn my TV up, thinking it had broken. But then I realized the sound of the fan had faded with it. The only way I can describe it is comparing it to someone turning the volume down on a car radio. I was suddenly overwhelmed by an intense feeling of euphoria. I have never experienced anything like it. I absolutely cannot describe how utterly at peace I felt. I was able to comprehend what was happening, and then it clicked in my head that I was dying. Keep in mind that I'm in second grade, so this is a pretty intense conclusion, but I just knew. I rolled over onto my back, ready to, and excited to accept my fate. That was when I saw it. There was a large white figure in my doorway, just hovering and pulsating a white aura. I quickly panicked and began calling out for my brother. His room was across the hall. The figure glided to the end of my bed and just sat there, watching. I'm not really sure how much time passed, but the figure suddenly vanished. Sound came back, and the euphoria disappeared. I jumped out of bed and ran into my brother's room, where I practically flew into his bed. He woke up, and when he saw how panicked I was, he began to panic as well. I was hysterical and just kept telling him it was a ghost. We did what any other kids would do and hid under the covers. After a while, we got anxious, and I bravely made a peephole in the blanket to check the time on the clock, hoping that it would be daylight soon. 5:30. The clock read 5:30 in the morning. Then the phone rang, and it rang and rang and rang. Me and my brother started to panic even more. Then silence. Once again, it began to ring and ring and ring. We jumped out of bed and took turns running from light switch to light switch until we had a light path to the living room. Our house was 5,000 square feet. This was not an easy task. We got to the living room and watched cartoons until my mom woke up. She was livid, yelling at us for being up so early. I told her I saw a ghost, which only made her more upset. My brother, who was always tormenting my irrational fears, got mad at her and started telling her this wasn't a joke and it wasn't my imagination. I started telling her to check the phone because I saw the ghost around 5:30 and it must have been the ghost calling. Kid logic. She went to check the phone and went to the other room for a while. Suddenly, she wasn't upset anymore. When we asked if it was said ghost, she said it was a telemarketer. She was so nice about it, she let me sleep in her room for the next few days. I thought maybe since it was my brother's birthday that day, she just didn't want to argue, but she never let me sleep in her room. I got home from school on the 15th, and I saw the ghost in the early hours on the 13th. My mom called me to the family room and told me to sit in her lap, that she needed to tell me something. I obliged. You see, my great-grandma passed away in the hospital at 5:30 a.m. And the phone calls were my grandma calling to notify us. Me and great-grandma were extremely close. To this day, I get chills thinking about it. I know that there are a few ways to explain the occurrence, but I know for a fact that it was 100% a paranormal experience. My brother and my mom still back me up on this to this day. This story's called It Really Happened. I would like to share with you an experience I had about 10 years ago, give or take. I learned several years after this incident what happened to me is what doctors call sleep paralysis. I say they're full of it. It really happened. Let me preface by saying I do not use drugs, outside of caffeine and nicotine, of course. I do not drink alcohol of any sort. So, this was not a hallucination caused by either of the two, nor do I have any mental issues that I know of. Let's make that clear. Going back about a year before this incident, at that time, I was really into ghost hunting shows. I watched and recorded any and every show I could find that was about a team of ghost hunters investigating haunted places. Some were really good, and others just sucked. No disrespect. I remember watching an episode of... Wait, in order to post on here, I can't use any real names, places, or addresses. Okay, let's see if I can do this. I remember watching the show where the lead hunter guy is a muscle-bound jerk who don't like bullies, but in turn is one himself. He orders his crew around like he owns them, and they follow him blindly like sheep. I think you know the one. It's a good show. At least it used to be. Anyway, they were investigating. Oh crap. Here we go again. They were investigating a bar owned by an old country singer located in one of the southern states who wrote a semi-popular song about a girl. Everyone in the paranormal community says this place is truly haunted. Okay, now that's over with. Back to the story. They were down in the basement, I think. It's been a while since I've seen it, and to this day is the only episode of that show I will never watch again. They were talking with some guy about what goes on there, when up in the left top corner of the screen there appeared a shadow figure wearing a cowboy hat standing in the doorway. At this time, in the show, they just stopped the film and pointed out when they were actually down there. They didn't seem to see this figure and only discovered it while reviewing the footage. I was naive back then and didn't really know much about the paranormal. I figured, it's a TV show. What harm could it really do? Boy, was I wrong. I now know that ghosts, entities, or whatever you want to call them, can follow you home from places and are made up of energy and can travel through any energy source they want. And one did. Now that I've given you the backstory, let's proceed with the reason why I'm actually writing this. Many years before this incident, an old friend of mine, back when I was like 11 or 12, who I met through playing baseball on the same team. Anyway, he had recently bought a house and was looking for someone to just give his old trailer or mobile home to, which is where this incident happened. We had lost contact over the years, but unbeknownst to me, he had kept in contact with my father. My father gave him my number. He called me up and made me an offer I couldn't refuse. A free trailer, just pay lot rent. Oh, hell yeah, I'll take it. The trailer was old and needed work, but it was a good deal. I moved in, did some minor repairs, and a couple of weeks after that, I invited my father and stepmother over for dinner. My stepmother is what she calls an old soul. She can sense when things are not right with the universe. She took one look at the place and said, "There's bad juju here. I don't like it." Every time she came to visit, she was nervous. She would not sit still, always looking down the hallway. She eventually stopped coming. She said it was too thick for her, whatever that meant. I just thought she was nuts. I now know she's not. I lived there for many years, had some strange things happen, seeing apparitions out of the corner of my eye, voices, cold breezes, etc. I just chalked it up to bad lighting, outside noises, insulation issues. Some rational explanation until that night. The night that changed my whole belief system forever. The night I will never forget. I was laying in bed, asleep on my back, like I always do, when I woke up and noticed a black figure standing in the doorway of my bedroom. The hallway light was on. I always leave it on in case I need to make a bathroom run late at night. The light from behind the figure showed it had a head, 2 arms, and 2 legs, but no eyes. It was just standing there. I blinked a couple times to make sure I was seeing what I was seeing, and sure enough, I was. Only this time, when I looked at it, it was wearing a cowboy hat. The moment I realized that, I physically saw it jump from the standing position in the doorway over top of the bed, land on top of me, next to me. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I saw the figure sitting on top of me. It reached its hands down into my chest and started squeezing my lungs. I couldn't breathe. It was squeezing the life right out of me. There I was, gasping for air, paralyzed, and unable to make a sound. Just when I thought I was about to die, a series of intensely bright white lights started flashing all around the room, like a strobe light on steroids. I closed my eyes to shield them from the lights. It was that bright. All of a sudden, my body jerked a couple of times, like a convulsion, and then stopped. I opened my eyes, and it was gone. I was able to breathe again. I lied there, heavy breathing for a good 20 minutes, too scared to move. When I finally got the nerve to try, I slowly moved my right hand over to my nightstand. Still shaking from fear, I grabbed my phone to check the time. I always do this when I wake up in the middle of the night. The time was 3:48 a.m., the witching hour. Needless to say, I did not go back to sleep that night. I cautiously got out of bed so not to wake up my wife and turned on every light in the house. Every single one, including all the bedroom lights. How my wife stayed sleeping, I don't know, but thankfully she did. I made a pot of coffee, grabbed my Bible, and sat at the dining room table, drinking coffee. Bible in hand until the morning came. I must have smoked at least a pack and a half of cigarettes in that 3-hour span of time. I'm good with that. I'm still alive. I asked my wife if she had seen or heard anything strange the night before. She said no, and I left it at that. I didn't dare tell her what happened, and I still haven't. She probably wouldn't believe me anyway. My wife and I stayed at the trailer for about 2 months after that. When we got the opportunity to rent an actual house, we took it. We packed all our things and moved out. On the last day we were at the trailer, my wife had left the vacuum in the back bedroom where this experience happened. She asked if I would go get the vacuum, and I agreed. Upon entering the room, a weird sense of dread fell over me, and something inside of me told me I needed to get out of there quick. I grabbed the vacuum, ran down the hallway, and out the front door as fast as I could, slamming the door behind me. I then turned around and yelled, "You want this place? You can have it. I'm gone." My wife looked at me like I lost my mind. My father and stepmother helped us move, along with some friends. My stepmother insisted that we drive all the vehicles that contained our belongings over bodies of water to block any of the bad juju from coming with us into the new house. We did, and have had no bad experiences in our new home. Aside from a few really bad dreams I had the first couple nights we were there about the trailer, but that was it. Well, that's my story. I don't really care if you believe me or not. but I know for a fact it really happened. This story's called The Quiet Neighbor. Just about the first thing anyone new to the neighborhood learned was to avoid Bud Fillmore. Cantankerous, territorial, and fueled by what seemed to be a deep-seated hatred for just about everything. He was the kind of man that childhood nightmares were made of. Although he'd only lived there for a few months longer than us, by the time my family moved in across the street from the Fillmore house, his reputation was already firmly established. When other neighbors came by with their cookies and casseroles to welcome us and saw me and my brother, just 9 and 11, they'd pull my parents aside and offer hushed warnings. "Keep them away from that nasty little man across the way," Mrs. Devon said. "He can't stand children." "My son Bill swears Bud tried to run him down in his car," Mr. Crane said. "He'll look for any excuse to yell at them. He says the most terrible things," Mrs. Paul said. My parents thanked them, but I don't think they quite believed them. My mom especially wasn't fond of gossip, and she tried to take such rumors with a grain of salt until she could make her own decisions. She didn't have to wait long. My older brother, Scotty, and I were outside tossing a baseball back and forth one Saturday morning when Scotty tossed it too hard and too high. It sailed over my head, bounced in the street, and rolled to a stop at the very edge of Mr. Fillmore's yard. Both of us had overheard our neighbor's warnings and were hesitant to even look at the house, much less approach it. "Go get it, Liz," Scotty said, nudging my shoulder. "But you threw it," I replied. "So? You missed it." I couldn't reach it. My whining had no effect. He pushed me towards the road, and after checking both ways, I began to creep across towards our ball. I had almost reached it. I just had to take a couple more steps, and it would have been within my grasp when the front door of the house flew open. "What the hell are you doing?" A stout man with thin graying hair came bursting outside and stomped across his lawn towards me. My ball," I tried to say, pointing to it. "You brats throwing things at my house? Think it would be funny to break a window?" No." I glanced over my shoulder to see Scotty half poised to run inside and whimpered. "Get out of here," Mr. Fillmore snapped. "Can I just—" "No." Before I could react, he'd scooped up the baseball, which had barely been touching his grass, and stormed back inside. The whole front of his house seemed to shake with the force of his slammed door. It was the first of what would be many run-ins with everyone's least favorite neighbor. Our parents tried to talk to him about his behavior, but he just told them to keep their nosy little shits off his lawn and away from his house if we didn't want trouble. Dad thought about calling the cops on him, but his mom became fond of saying there was no law against being rude. So we were just told to try and be more careful. He must not have always been such a bull. Mom said over dinner about a month after we'd moved in. "He's married, you know." Dad scoffed at the idea. "Oh yeah? How do you know?" "Dolores Devon was by again for a chat and it came up. Bud wears a ring and she said she sees Mrs. Phillimore looking out the windows from time to time. But the poor woman never comes outside. She thinks she heard Bud say it was cancer once." "Poor lady. Sick and married to that," Dad said. "Terrible, isn't it? But it does explain a bit more about him. He's just trying to keep things quiet and peaceful around his house." "Yeah, sure," Scotty muttered, and Mom frowned at him. "He's probably very sad and lashes out without meaning to." "He's an asshole," Scotty said. "Language," Dad warned. "But yeah, he is." Whatever his reasoning, it really didn't matter. We all agreed it would be best to just try and avoid Bud Phillimore. Scotty and I were extra careful to keep all of our toys well within the confines of our own yard when we played outside. I also couldn't help but keep a wary eye on the house across the street, just in case he decided to be extra crazy and we had to run for it. That's when I started to notice Mrs. Phillimore. Almost every time Scotty and I were out and I happened to glance at their house, I would see a tall, slender figure outlined behind the sheer curtains in one of the upstairs windows. While I couldn't get a very good look at her, I figured it couldn't be anyone but the missus. Mr. Phillimore didn't have anyone else. She never banged on the window or shouted at us like her husband. She'd just stand there, watching us. I like to imagine that she was a nice lady, a quiet neighbor who just enjoyed seeing kids at play. I remembered my mom saying Mrs. Phillimore was sick, and I felt sorry that she was trapped in her house with her horrible husband. So I tried to be nice and smile and wave once. Just once. Mr. Phillimore appeared on his front stoop and yelled at me for being a pest until I retreated inside. When I peeked out the living room window later, Mrs. Phillimore wasn't in her usual spot anymore. Eventually, we got used to Mr. Phillimore glowering at us as he drove slowly past. His short temper and his loud voice. It was such a regular thing that our fear turned to caution, turned to eye-rolling and dismissiveness. "Bud doesn't own the street. You kids go out and be kids, and if he has a problem with it, I'll deal with him," Dad said. After that, we started to be a little less careful with our things and a little more free with our laughter. We lost a few balls to the Phillimore yard, 1 or 2 frisbees, but nothing we really cared too much about. Nothing until Scotty's remote-controlled helicopter. It had been a birthday present, and we were both eager to try it out. As soon as we finished supper, we raced out the front lawn, where Scotty prepared for the helicopter's first flight. Under my brother's inexperienced and clumsy guidance, the helicopter lifted slowly from the ground and staggered drunkenly through the air. In his excitement to keep it aloft, Scotty didn't even realize it was heading right for Phillimore's yard until it was too late. "Scotty!" I tugged at his arm to try and turn it off course, but it only made things worse. The little helicopter took a nosedive straight into the hedges under Mr. Phillimore's bay window. Scotty frantically wiggled the controls, but the helicopter's blade was stuck fast in the thick greenery. As if he had been waiting for us to slip up, the front door was flung open and he practically pounced on the toy. "What have I told you?" he bellowed. Before we could argue, he had already disappeared back into his house. Upstairs, the curtain fluttered just so, and I knew Mrs. Phillimore was watching. I wanted to call up to her and ask her to get the helicopter back, but Scotty grabbed my wrist and dragged me behind him to find Mom and Dad. When our parents went over later, he refused to come to the door. "Don't worry, kids," they assured us. "Next time we see him, we'll sit down and have a real discussion about this." That wasn't enough for Scotty, though. I followed him up to his room and sat on the end of his bed while he paced back and forth, ranting about how unfair it all was. He was fuming and furious, and he wanted his birthday present back now. "But how?" I asked. He paused, his gaze sliding to his window and the house beyond. "We're going to take it." It was a childish, simple, stupid plan with no thought to consequence or punishment. We were going to break into the Phillimore house and get all of our things back. "We'll do it when he goes out next. I can figure out how to get the lock open. It can't be that hard. Then we just have to find our stuff." "What about Mrs. Phillimore? She never leaves." "You can distract her or something. I don't know. We'll figure it out." "I don't know, Scotty," I said uneasily. I didn't want to disrupt a poor, sick lady for a few toys. "Don't worry. We'll just be in and out. She probably won't even notice we're there." I doubted that, but I had a hard time saying no to my big brother. Scotty put his plan into action the very next afternoon. We were playing a game of horse in the driveway when Mr. Phillimore's garage opened and his car chugged to life. He was wearing his customary scowl as he drove by. The moment he turned the corner, Scotty chucked our basketball off to the side and bolted across the street. I checked to see if Mrs. Phillimore was in her window, and when I saw no sign of her, I followed. Scotty's idea of getting the lock open turned out to be using a small rock to break the window pane on the door above the latch. It was something he'd seen in a movie or something like that. Immediately, I had images of flashing red and blue lights and handcuffs, and my stomach turned sharply. But my brother whispered that it would be fine. "He can't prove it was us. Everyone on the street hates him." He sounded so confident that all I could do was nod. Scotty reached carefully through the broken glass, careful not to cut himself, and found the deadbolt. It clicked out of place and he pushed the door open, letting us into Mr. Phillimore's house. I clung to the back of Scotty's shirt as we tiptoed across the kitchen. It was spotless, obsessively so, and smelled of cleaning supplies. Every window had something tacked over it, old blankets and towels, blocking out the bright afternoon sun and casting the room into a gloomy darkness that made the room seem small and oppressive. I swallowed hard and forced myself to follow Scotty. Every room was the same. Very clean, very organized, and shrouded in shadows. The bay window that I knew he spied on us from had a little hole cut into the heavy velveteen material, just big enough for someone to see out of. I could just picture him sitting on his plastic-covered couch, watching us, waiting for us to get too close. It was enough to make me shudder. We cleared the whole downstairs pretty quickly, but there was no sign of our things. "Shit," Scotty hissed. "He must keep it upstairs." "But Mrs. Phillimore." "Just stay close and stay quiet," okay?" I nodded, too nervous to say anything else anyway. We'd only gotten up a few steps when the floorboards on the second floor creaked. Scotty immediately pressed himself against the wall and motioned for me to do the same. We listened to the soft padding of footsteps crossing from one room to another. "Scotty," I whispered, grabbing at his sleeve with both hands. "Let's just go." "No, he went too far this time. I'm going to get my helicopter." Door hinges squeaked from somewhere upstairs, and the footsteps stopped. Scotty pulled his arm from me and scampered up the remaining steps. Reluctantly, I went up too. We found a guest bedroom first. It was all muted colors and magazine-quality furniture, void of any warmth or personality, like it was just set up for show, never intended for use. At least it was a bit brighter up there. The windows only had a few layers of sheer curtains over them, enough to obscure visibility, but still let in light. The second room was obviously Mr. Philomore's. It was the most lived-in looking room of them all, and even then, that was only because there were some pictures hanging on the walls and some personal items on the nightstand. The bed was meticulously made. All the clothing, most of which was masculine, hung neatly in the closet. There wasn't even any stray hairs in the brush on the vanity or anything. I wondered how someone could live in such a cold, lifeless house. There was only one room left upstairs, the one Mrs. Phillimore must have gone into. Its doors stood half open. Scotty and I traded a look, his determined, mine silently pleading with him to go. He took a step towards the door. I shook my head and grabbed at the back of his shirt again. He brushed me off and placed the flat of his hand on the door, pushing it open slowly. Inside, the room was almost empty, except for a large vanity against one wall. A framed wedding picture was on it, and I recognized Mr. Phillimore, despite being younger and thinner. In front of the vanity, posed on a tall stool, was a mannequin. She was wearing what I thought of as a 50s housewife dress, white with little pink and green flowers all over it, a string of pearls, and a blonde wig carefully combed back into a bun. Her featureless face was fixed on the mirror in front of her. Scotty's brow wrinkled, showing the same confusion as I'd felt. We'd both heard Mrs. Phillimore walk to this room, but there was no one there. "Let's just go," I begged, a cold sweat starting to trickle down the back of my neck. Scotty shifted his weight, obviously torn, and the floorboard beneath his feet groaned. The mannequin's head turned sharply towards us. Scotty leapt back with a yelp and an arm thrown out protectively in front of me. "Liz," his voice was trembling, "run." I stumbled back down the hall on legs that didn't want to work. I could hear Scotty stomping along behind me and, behind him, a rapid skittering. We skid at the top of the stairs and I grabbed the railing to keep from falling headlong down the steps. While I righted myself, I dared to glance back down the hallway. It was empty. Where did it get? Something thudded against the ceiling. We both looked up and screamed. The mannequin was crawling spider-like over our heads. She wrenched her head completely around, turning her blank face towards us, and flitted towards the wall. She started to descend, the whole time facing us. I was still screaming when Scotty hooked his arm around my waist and hauled me down the steps. We crashed at the landing, tripping over one another, and we could hear the click of fiberglass on wood as she pursued us. I was crying, scrambling on my hands and knees across the floor, and my brother was shouting for me to get up, to go. He grabbed the back of my shirt and practically threw me down the hall. And then Scotty was shrieking. I spun. The mannequin was crouched on the last step, one arm outstretched. She had fingers wrapped around Scotty's ankle. They were tightening, until his bones started to crunch beneath her grip. He kicked at her with his other leg, but it did nothing. She started to drag him back towards the stairs. "Scotty!" I screamed, but before I could move, he looked up at me and shook his head furiously. "Liz!" He could barely get the word out through the fear and pain that masked his face. "Run!" I wanted to stay. I wanted to grab his hand and pull with all my might and drag him out of that house with me. But he shouted again, "Run, run," over and over until the words became a garbled mess of howling, terrified cries that chased me out the same door we'd come in through. It was the last time I ever saw my big brother. No trace of Scotty was ever found. My parents searched. Police searched. There were dogs and special agents, and tons of time, money, and energy were put into trying to find him. But none of it mattered. It was as if he had simply vanished. Bud Fillmore wasn't a suspect very long. With no evidence and no history of any kind of criminal record, he was let go. Scotty was dubbed a missing child, reduced to a single box of paperwork that was all too soon moved to the cold case stacks. No one believed me when I told them what really happened. They all said Scotty must have been kidnapped on our way back from Mr. Fillmore's house, and I was too young to really understand it, that I had gotten confused and, in my fear, made up some story using the scary thing I'd just encountered. Mr. Fillmore's mannequin belonged to his late wife, Sharon. He kept it after she passed because it reminded him of her. Sometimes he'd move it around, put it in a window, but it wasn't alive. You understand that, right, Liz? My therapist was fond of asking. I told her what she wanted to hear, even if I knew it was a lie. The adults preferred it that way. It was easier for all of us. Maybe that was why I never showed anyone the note that had been left taped to our door, typed and anonymous. In all that it said, "I tried to keep you away. I didn't think it would have changed anything." I knew, though, and I never doubted myself or the fact that Scotty had sacrificed himself for me. And up until Mr. Fillmore packed up and moved a few years later, I would sit in my brother's room, and I would stare at the window, at his house. I would watch the second-story window, waiting for the telltale dark figure to appear behind the curtains. Waiting for the quiet neighbor that everyone said didn't exist. A little tale about a Halloween that I experienced. So wrap yourself up in a nice warm blanket and prepare to be scared. When I was younger, we frequently visited my grandparents around holidays, even though we didn't live in the same town. My aunt lived 2 houses down from my grandparents. The lady in the house between us was super creepy. She was a large woman, over 6 feet. She wore logging chains around her neck, a dress, and work boots. The only time I remember seeing her outside was either in her garden in the back or when she was washing the outside of her house, scrubbing the actual building. She did this often. During these times, she would yell at us kids and call us all kinds of things. She would tell us the devil would be coming for us. The adults told us to leave her alone and to avoid her. We would run the distance between my aunts and my grandparents because when you pass by, she was watching out the windows. It was creepy, and we never went alone. One Halloween, one of the cousins dared us to trick-or-treat her house. I remember how scared I was, but I didn't want to be a chicken. Plus, I was going with the group. One of us rang the doorbell, and there was a lot of banging noise in the house, like doors slamming. When she answered the door, she had a severed head in her hands, and we all went screaming. The adults told us it was just a Halloween prop, and we knew we shouldn't be bothering her and deserved to be scared. About a month later, my parents got a phone call that the lady had tried to kill my aunt while she was bringing in groceries and had my young cousin in her arms. The lady had one of those rope saws and had come up behind my aunt, trying to attack her. She put it over her head and around her neck and proceeded to saw. My aunt naturally flipped and started kicking the door. My uncle came and beat the lady down with a fire poker. The police investigation revealed that the woman had been digging tunnels under her home, which were coming up under my aunt's, my grandparents', and another neighbor's house. She had been bringing the dirt up and putting it in the raised beds of the gardens. She also had a shrine of some sort underground, which had a few severed heads around it. My aunt did survive, but has a long scar across her neck. Lady with a severed head, let's not meet again. This story is called The Doll in the Storage Room. When I was younger, I'd go to visit my grandparents all the time. They lived in a one-floor house with an unfinished basement. I never liked it down there. It felt small for a big basement. There was a little door down there that was for storage, and I always got a horrible feeling when going close to it. And let me add that this was a newer house. It was only about 6 years old. Now, during the time I was about 7, I felt so uncomfortable going down there. Even when I was with someone, I didn't like it. I remember going down there with my grandma to help with something. She had to run upstairs because someone rang the doorbell. She said she would be right back, even though she knew how I felt about being alone down there. But I nodded and said okay. She was gone and I was alone, and I started to get a bad feeling in the pit of my stomach. I didn't move, and I didn't want to. Even though the lights were on. Now, this is where everything started happening, and it still gives me chills, but even though the lights were on, it still had an unsettling feeling. The lights started to flicker, and I started to hear noises and what sounded like talking. and it was not coming from upstairs, but in the storage room. I heard someone say my name, and I'm telling you, this part freaks me out the most. Every time I go back to this in my memory, I start to shake. The voice sounded like my grandma, and I was confused as hell. How am I hearing her when she's all the way upstairs? I didn't want to move, but me being the curious one that I am, I started moving towards the storage room door. The closer I got, the worse the bad feeling came in the pit of my stomach. When I got to the door, the lights turned off in the basement. I wanted to run upstairs and hide, go home somewhere that wasn't the basement. But I heard my name again, for the second time. My grandma's voice, asking me to open the door to help her. What was I supposed to do? So I did, and I regret it. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black. I couldn't hear anything but faint laughing. That felt like forever. But then the laughing stopped, and the lights turned back on in the basement. And I felt a little bit better with the lights back on. But the downside, I could see a little bit into the storage room. And what I saw has never escaped my mind. I saw a small clown doll in the storage room. And my grandma hates clowns with a passion and absolutely wants nothing to do with them. So why is there a clown doll? I had no idea. Then the lights turned on, and in the storage room, I saw red that looked like blood all over the place. I screamed and blacked out, and the next thing I knew, I was laying on the couch. My grandma was looking at me and asking if I was okay. I have no idea if that was real or a dream, but it sure as hell felt real. This story's called Every Year a Kid in Our Town Goes Missing. We just found out why. For 20 years, a kid would go missing in our town each summer. They'd vanish without a trace and without evidence of foul play, nor proof that anyone had actually died. No bodies were recovered during the investigations, nor was anyone retrieved alive. By all means, they seem to have disappeared into thin air. Naturally, such occurrences come along a multitude of conspiracy theories, ranging from monsters to kidnappers with supernatural powers. Most of us, however, blame the lake. It was a beautiful piece of water hidden in the idyllic woods of Arboretum. Despite appearing perfectly still on the surface, there had always been a strong undercurrent around the center of the lake. It was theorized that it was caused by an underground river, but thus far, no one had been able to prove it. So, after multiple ignored warnings to stay away, the police simply put up a barrier around the center, where the current felt the strongest. Me and my friends were some of the many people to go swimming there, despite the rumors. We absolutely loved the lake, with its crystal clear waters and bizarre lack of animal life. We'd spend many summers there, never leaving, until our skin had turned crispy red, poured by the tempting promise of ice cream from our parents. We were young, and we felt invincible. Years passed, and the three of us were about to graduate high school. While we were naturally excited to move on to college and new adventures, we desperately needed one last hurrah to say goodbye. So, in the summer of 2019, we decided to solve the mystery of the missing children. Thanks to our part-time jobs, we'd been able to save up a decent amount of cash. We used some of it to purchase cheap bird-watching cameras. Our plan was to place them in the areas where the kids had last been seen. It just so happened that most of those areas were within the woods, concentrated around the lake. The whole area was weirdly shaped, which meant we'd have to keep an eye on parts of the lake ourselves. The center in particular was hard to get a view of from the shore. We thought ourselves so clever to have come up with such a genius plan. Little did we know that the police had thought of the exact same scheme, only without results. Nevertheless, we set out on our adventure to save our town, thinking nothing could stop us. By the time we placed our cameras, no one had gone missing. We were hoping to catch the moment as it happened and swoop in to stop it. In hindsight, it was a poorly thought out plan, but we were teenagers. What else could one expect? We strategically put the cameras around the forest and some by the water. Each day, we'd collect the recordings to check the footage. In addition, we'd camp out around the lake and just enjoy the weather. The summer went on with little incident until the first week of August. Then, a kid by the name of Alex Florence had inexplicably gone missing in the middle of the day. He'd last been seen throwing a ball around with his sister by the lake. He was only 7 years old. The police did their usual search, checking street cameras and sending divers into the lake to search for drowned bodies. Still, nothing could be found. We went through the footage, but couldn't find anything. The only part we hadn't yet investigated was the center of the lake. I had just spent some extra money on a waterproof camera and figured we could at least find out where the current went. We connected the camera to a flashlight and tied it to a rope. We took a canoe and paddled past the barriers, ready to finally solve the mystery. Though we couldn't see the bottom of the lake, we expected it to be around 50 feet deep. I tossed the camera into the warm waters and measured the depth using the rope. Before long, it had sunk out of sight. 20 feet, 30 feet, 40 feet, 50. It had reached the supposed bottom, yet it kept sinking deeper and deeper. Within a few minutes, it had reached 100 feet. I looked at my friends in disbelief, wondering if it had been swept away. But based on the direction of the rope, it was just going further down. Once our rope had reached the end of its length, we had no choice but to pull it back up. Hopefully, the footage could provide us with some answers. We eagerly returned home and uploaded the recordings to my computer. The quality of the video was only semi-decent. At first, it showed the clear waters below, only lit up by the flashlight attached to the camera. It sank straight to the bottom at 50 feet, just as expected. Then, we saw something else. It was just a tiny hole that opened and closed, pulsating like a mouth, trying to chew on something. It only opened for brief periods of time, which is probably why it went unnoticed for so long. Nevertheless, it produced a current that immediately sucked in our camera. It got pulled through a tiny tunnel, small enough for a child, but too narrow for an adult. The tunnel went on for another 20 feet or so before opening up into a giant underwater cave. There, it kept sinking deeper until something horrific finally came into view. It was Alex Florence, the missing kid. He'd been partially digested by strange plants emerging from the cave wall. They reached out like tendrils looking for food. The boy was little more than barren bones, only recognizable by the fragments of his clothes still there. The camera sunk even deeper. At last, we could see the cave floor. It was littered with hundreds, if not thousands, of animal and human bones, left to be forgotten for all of eternity. That's when we pulled the camera back up. We'd reached our goal, but another kid had died. Next, we just handed the footage over to the police, and that was it. This year, when we visited our hometown for the holidays, the lake had been completely blocked off. We set out to have one last adventure, but the image of those bodies is something we'll never get over. This story is called The Man in the Mirror. I used to visit my friend at her house out in a rural farming area before she moved. I'd sleep over a lot, and we'd just hang out and draw. I usually slept in the living room on the couch, and there were 2 mirrors in the living room, fairly close to the TV. When the TV was off and I was walking by, I started seeing shadows move behind me. I thought it was just a warped TV screen or something. Then, one evening, I walked into the living room to get my sketchbook so I could sketch in her bedroom. I bent over and picked it up, stood up straight, looked in the mirror, and there was a man behind me. A man standing in the hallway leading to the living room. He was average height, bald, and a bit old. I turned to look at him, and no one was there. Turned to look at that mirror again, and he was gone. I felt a little spooked. Another time, we were just sitting in the living room, and we heard what sounded like little kids' footsteps running across the upstairs quickly. She had 2 adult siblings, but they were out at work, leaving us alone. Around that time, I decided to sleep in my friend's room instead of the living room, only to wake up in the middle of the night to see 4 of her posters slowly get peeled off the wall. It wasn't them falling and dragging each other down. They looked as if someone were carefully unsticking the tape and taking them down. The next morning, my friend put them back up saying, "I need to get better tape for these." She and her family eventually moved out because they couldn't afford to live there anymore. We had never really talked about what happened in the house, as if talking about it would make it worse. But after she moved, I finally said, "Dude, your house was haunted. I hope you realize that." She replied with, "Yeah, I knew it was. Some guy and his granddaughter lived there, but he killed her, and then himself. So it was probably them or something. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to scare you away from hanging out with me." Then she dug out a copy of a news article she got from a local paper about the murder. The picture that went with the article was a picture of the man I saw standing behind me. Unfortunately, I have no clue where to find that article now, or if my friend still has her copy. If I dug enough, I could probably find it, but I don't have the time, and I don't live near that area anymore. I don't even remember her town name or address because they moved out close to 10 years ago. So You'll just have to take my word for it.